Hello everyone and welcome to another video on the Toliss Airbus A321, and today we're going to talk about the ILS and how we might fly it in the Airbus and some of the things we need to look out for when we do. I am a real-world Airbus pilot, so hopefully this can bring some extra context to your home simulations, but as always this isn't for any real-world use, it's just for our home entertainment in X-Plane and with the Airbus. So let's get started. And here we are now entering the hold, ready for our approach into Berlin Tegel Echo Delta Delta Tango, expecting to land on runway 08 left as we have loaded into the FMGC. If you need help with the FMGC or setting up the aircraft for this approach or any other approach, I have some videos out which I'll provide a link to, which cover how to set up the approach into the FMGC, as well as if you need any help on any other parts of the flight. I've got tutorials covering a wide range of topics, including the initial cold and dark setup and loading of the computers. So for today, we're talking about the ILS. And what I want to do is, first of all, bring you to the chart. So from this hold, which we have here, we're expecting to head off and fly our approach. So we're in the hold at Larnham. And then, as we can see, if I bring up the navigation display, I'll set it to plan and zoom in. And now I can scroll through on the MCDU and it will show me each point. So from Larnham, we head down via these DMEs from KLF, which we can see here, KLF 41, and take us to Ligba, which is here on the ILS, above 3,000 feet. And then if I look at my vertical profile, Ligba is the platform, 3,000 feet. And then from there, we begin our descent via the outer marker, 1,530 feet. So that's all coded into the FMGC. We'll carry on with the go around. I also have a video available on how to do the go around if you need that. But here we go. Climb a runway track, 3,000 feet at 4 miles from Tegel, make a left turn to 5,000 feet. So initially 3,000, then 5,000 after that. And that's the coding. So what are some things we need to do as we're preparing for this approach in particular? Well, when you're flying an ILS, a good thing to check is always going to be the DME and what is it based off of. So often it'll say ILS DME, but as we can see here, it's just an ILS. So an ILS DME, the DME is co-located, so we know how far we are away from landing, just based on the DME from the ILS, which will show up in the screen on the PFD down here. However, in this situation, it won't. We need to use another source, and as we can see, the DME is based on the Tegel, Tango Golf Lima VOR, and that's more apparent if you have to search around on the chart sometimes, but on here we've got the localizer and the ident, final approach course, so the basic things like that. But to get the DME, and it needs the DME, we scroll down here and you can see Tegel DME 9876543, and that gives us our distance. It's also quite clear on this vertical profile where it says the distance is only based on Tango Golf Lima, the Tegel VOR. So what's the implications of that? Well, it means that our distance to the runway is not quite the same as it would be otherwise. Luckily, they're quite close here. It's sort of halfway down the runway, but effectively we are slightly closer than that DME suggests. So that's something you need to account for. As we can see, at 0.5 miles from touchdown, which is the missed approach point, we're actually 1.3 miles from the VOR. So we're about 0.8 of a mile closer. So if we round it up, we're a mile closer. So if we're basing our configuring on these distances, we need to add a mile to everything. As you'll have seen in my approach setup, I've gone through the flight plan now. So here's the RadNav page. So we know that we need to have the Tegel VOR. Now it is auto-tuned, but I would recommend typing it in. And you can just type in Tango Golf Lima, and then it appears big. And you can check it's tuned 112.3. The course is not relevant for this. We're just using it for VOR distance. If I go back to a normal sort of page, and then I can see using these little switches up here, that's how I get the display. So it's set to radio 1, VOR 1, and that side will be obviously VOR 2. So now I've got my distance displayed here. So that's the distance I'm basing it off of. So I need to add a mile to this because we won't get a DME on the PFD like normal. But there is another thing I can do to help. If I type it in here, Echo Delta Delta Tango 08 left, I will get an actual distance, and this is not based on any ground nav aids. This is just the airplane knows where it is using its navigation internally. So we've got GPS and we've also got the IRSs telling us where we are, and that is more accurate. So that's a good distance to the runway. That would be a bit like an ILS DME. So that's another thing to use. So this one we can just use as normal. Performance, as shown in my previous setup videos, I've entered the weather, the QNH of 1015, 15 degrees, light headwind of 0605, and then we're going to have to put in our minima. So an ILS minima, you see here, ILS D8H refer to minimums. So I need to scroll down to the bottom for this one, and we're doing a straight in landing, 08 left, ILS, little note 1, but that's not really going to apply to us today. We're going to do a decision altitude and then in brackets height. So this is a category 1 ILS we're doing today. So I'm going to use the decision altitude, which is 310, and that's the decision altitude there, 310. That is an altitude above sea level, so it's pretty reliable, and you can see the height is 200 feet. So its altitude is 310 feet above sea level, but above the runway it's 200 feet, which is the standard lowest minimum for a category 1 ILS. I'm going to do another video on lower than standard and LVP approaches, which would include category 2, category 3 A and B and auto landing. But here you go, this is just some information for you. So for Cat 1, just put it into MDA, minimum decision altitude. DH, decision height, would use the 200 as a rad out, but we don't use that for category 1 ILSs, which is why it's written like this. The big one is the one you're going to use, the bold 310. Great, we'll do a config full landing. You select that now, and if you were going to do a config 3, which I show in my landing tutorial, you'd also select landing flaps 3 on the overhead panel. Then we're going to go into our go-around phase. So thrust reduction acceleration altitude, it defaults to 1,500 feet above the ground. So that is 1,600 feet because there's a 100-foot elevation. And engine out acceleration altitude, well, if we have an engine failure and we go around, we need to climb to the go-around platform altitude before we accelerate because it will be a level acceleration. So as we said earlier, initially that's 3,000 feet, although it does later become 5,000. But at first it's 3,000, so we'll enter that for now, and then we can adjust as required. Fuel prediction, you're obviously going to check that in terms of alternate and diversion planning, but we won't go into that now, and the second will just be a copy. So there's some of the things to consider for a setup. Now some other ILS specific items include the flight path angle, or the angle of the ILS. So can you see what the angle of this ILS is in particular? If I zoom out a bit, it gets a little bit easier. It's hidden a bit, I think, on these Jefferson charts, but it is here. ILS glide slope or localizer descent angle is 3.00 degrees. So that's a standard ILS. 3 degrees is what we expect to fly. And that's great. So we don't need to account too much for any configuring. So for this case, I'm going to do a decelerated approach. We have two options in the Airbus, really. We can do a stabilized approach where we configure early and descend on the ILS fully configured, or we can do a decelerated approach where we will start down the ILS, flap 180 knots, something like that, and then as we descend, we'll configure there, which is typically what you do day to day as an airline pilot. It's more efficient, it's quieter, it's what the people living nearby would like, it burns less fuel. But you've got to get it right. So if this was a steep approach, it would be harder to descend and configure because the airplane wouldn't slow down. Also, if there's a strong tailwind. So in those cases, we'd look at doing a stabilized, and I will talk about that later in the video where we'll fly a slightly steeper approach. So for now, I'm going to plan to do a decelerated. So I'm going to be 3,000 feet, flap 1 at S speed, which will become clear later. And then once we're descending by 2,000 feet above the ground, I need to put out flap 2. And that's something we'll see as we fly down the approach later. Something worth checking is where your decel point is. So the Airbus, for a decelerated approach, is planning just to stabilize at VAP around 1,000 feet. And because of that, it can sometimes be a little bit late, so you have to be careful. If I was to go into manage speed now, it'll fly at whatever it has coded in, which we can see here is about 220 in the hold. It will then accelerate to 250 when we leave the hold, and it'll fly 250, and then we have this decel point, and that's shown on our display with this magenta D there. And that is the point at which the airplane, if we're flying along this green string, will automatically activate the approach phase. But it may not if you don't fly past that point, or it may do it later. So it's something you can also do yourself, and you must do before you manage the speed, and you'd activate the approach phase by selecting here. Great, so I think it's time we go and get started on the approach. As we leave the hold, I'm going to start my descent to 5,000 feet, put in the QNH of 1015, and there's our thrust idle open descent, 5,000 feet. Something that you would typically do passing 10,000 feet is just check that the accuracy of the aircraft is still good for your approach. So we've still got GPS primary and accuracy high. If there's any downgrades, you may need to go into heading or something like that. Also, we'll put on these LS buttons on both sides because that brings up our scales here for the ILS. It also starts to show us whether we have it identified or not. So I'm looking for the India Tango Lima Echo, which is identified, and it's identified because it's written there, 109.1. If it just showed the frequency, I would need to consider identifying it myself, and you can do that down here, and I just need to move the camera to show you. But on the audio control panel, excuse me, that was not very neat, we can select it. But it appears in the Toliss this is not modeled, so you would actually just select this ILS button here because the marker works, but in real life you'd press that and then it would play the audio, and you could use the Morse code to identify, and the Morse code is just helpfully written underneath there. But sadly that doesn't seem to be modeled at the moment. Also 10,000 feet, landing lights can come on, passengers have already been seated. So those are some other things we need to prepare for the approach. Finally, I mentioned earlier the elevation. It's very important we know what the elevation is for any approach because we need to know when we expect things to happen. So the elevation of this approach is 100, or for the runway here is 100 feet, and it's written there, airport elevation 122, runway slightly lower at 110, so about 100 feet. Therefore, my radio altimeter will first become alive at 2,500 feet above the ground. As I've got 100 feet elevation of the ground, that should be 2,600 feet on my altimeter. And that I can then use to confirm that I've got the correct QNH, and I will also confirm at the final approach fix, so at 3,000 feet, that my glide slope is making sense, and that is 3,000 feet, because the glide slope is based off the ground. There are some errors to be aware of with ILSs. Localizer false capture is a possibility where you arm the approach and it doesn't actually fly you onto the correct localizer. And the same with the glide slope, although that's slightly rarer. So you need to have a rough idea of what rate of descent you expect and also where you expect the localizer to be, which we can do quite easily in a modern aircraft like the Airbus with our navigation display here. Apologies for that. I've had to just improve the weather slightly to make sure the video recording worked smoothly. So apologies for the slight glitches you may have seen earlier. So now we're descending and we're heading out towards our ILS. I've got my distance to go, but you can see it would normally be displayed under here on the PFD, but sadly it's not. But I can see 23 miles. As we said, we're adding about a mile, so we're 22 miles from touchdown. So now I'm going to do my 3-degree calculation for my descent energy. So 6,000 feet above the ground. So if I times that by 3, 6, 12, 18, I need at least 18 miles for my 3-degree approach, plus a little bit to slow down, although 220 knots were quite reasonable. Some good distance and gates. I talk about this in my radar vectoring video if you're interested, but a rough idea for an ILS for this sort of approach would be 15 miles from the airport. I want to be no faster than 250 knots, 14 miles, 240 knots, 13 miles, 230 knots. And that's right down to sort of 6 miles, 160 knots. If you're 180 knots at 6 miles, for example, then you would need to start putting the gear down and slowing down. Otherwise, it's a sign that you are getting too fast. So once we fly through that magenta D, it will automatically activate the approach phase, but I'm not going to risk it. I'm going to do it now. So performance approach phase is now activated. And now when I manage the speed in the approach phase, it will go to green dot, and you can see at the bottom VAP 143 is displayed. When I put up the next stage of flap, it'll go to S speed and then F speed until we have full landing flap, and then it can go to VAP. Now I'm just going to carry on my descent down to 3,000 feet. So I know that 220 knots is fine up until 12 miles from the airport as a maximum, and I can see here 18 miles to go, so that's absolutely fine. Our speed is under control, and we'll just descend down to our platform altitude. As I said, we're going to intercept this approach at flap 1 and about S speed, and the guidance for this sort of approach would be but no later than 2,000 feet above the runway. So that's going to be 2,100 feet QNH. I need to put out flap 2, then gear down, then flap 3, then flap full. So we'll give that a go, and we'll see that actually that's quite close. If you want to be stabilized by 1,000 feet, it can be quite tricky. Okay, we're turning in now onto our final approach. If we're cleared for the approach, I can either arm the localizer or the approach push button. So if I just press the localizer first, it'll go into lock star because we're already there. And that's absolutely fine. I could have also pressed approach and it would also arm the glide slope. If you only arm the localizer, I cannot engage the other autopilot. You can only use one autopilot at a time because you might be flying a localizer only approach. But we're not today. We're going to fly a full glide slope. So before we get onto the glide slope, I'm going to put out flap 1, let it reduce to S speed. And now I'm going to arm the approach button, and we can see the glide slope's now armed. Now I can engage the other autopilot, autopilot 1 and 2. That's typically used for auto landing. We're going to disconnect the autopilot to land today, so it doesn't actually matter. You could just fly the approach with one autopilot, but why wouldn't you use both in case one fails, the other one can take over for you. So it's just another backup, which is useful for us. Now if I reduce that rate of descent, because the engines are trying to target that S speed, the speed will come back. Now in an Airbus A321, compared to the 319 or 320, I would be more likely to try and have flap 2 out by the time I'm on the glide slope, and we'll see why. It can be quite tricky to slow down. It's also going to be a distance issue. We're about, that says 12.8, so we're about just under 12 miles from touchdown, and we're 200 knots. But by the time we're at 2,000 feet, that's going to be too fast, so I may need to configure earlier than that standard decelerated approach we talked about. But in a 319 or a 320, it's more likely you could do that. So here's our glide slope star, that's now captured. I can put in the go and altitude, 3,000 feet. That's also my final approach fix. So I expected 9.7 from the Tango Golf Lima VOR to intercept. And there it is, 9.7, just starting down on the glide slope. So that's a good check on that. As we said, we want to be 2,100 feet would be for flap 2, but I'm actually going to configure earlier because we're 9 miles, 200 knots. So we're too fast now compared to my system that I showed you earlier. So there's flap 2. That's when the drag comes out. Until now, we've only had the slats, but flap 2 gives us the actual drag. And that is more useful for descending on the ILS. And there we go. The big flaps come out at the back. As we can see, though, I'm now 8 miles, 200 knots. Still too fast, so we're going to put the gear down. And these are some things you can use to control the energy. The wheels are a really, really good thing. So if you put the gear down, as long as you're below 250 knots, you can extend the landing gear. And now, obviously, there is a lot of drag on the outside of the airplane. How are we doing then compared to touchdown? We're about to be 6 miles from touchdown now, passing 2,000 feet. So we've already done our flap 2 and gear down. So it's starting to look a bit more reasonable. Once the gear goes down, we can arm the spoilers, put on the rest of the lights, then flap 3. And as long as we're below these orange eyebrows, this orange equal sign shows you the flap limit speed, so I can go to flap full. And now we are fully configured on final approach. And you can see there that we've had the engines at idle for quite a lot of that, and will shortly be stabilized about 1,300 feet, which is good. We don't want to stabilize just before 1,000 because you could find that you miss it or you get something wrong or there's a bit of a tailwind. Sometimes conditions outside the airplane, so thermals, if there was a hot day and you had rising hot air beneath you, that can sometimes give the airplane a lot more energy and make it very difficult to slow down. Things like that can and do happen. So it's worth having a little bit of room. But here we go, fully stabilized, engines are spooled up at their approach power setting at 1,000 feet. And now we'll carry on for our landing. For this approach, we're now in the rather lovely Norway, Kristiansand Airport. Code is Echo November Charlie November, and we're going to fly the ILS to runway 03. If we jump into the flight deck, we can see that I'm effectively on a sort of downwind, although I'm going to vector myself out to sea a bit and then turn it back around towards Ibnus. Here's the approach chart for this ILS 03. So a few differences from last time. We've got the coding and so on, which we'll check through, and you'd obviously do as we did earlier into Berlin. And we can see here it's an ILS DME. So this time it's coded and it will match the Charlie November 110350, which is there, 11035, and then we'll have a DME as we point in towards the runway, which as we should do. Now I've heard that there's some glitches in X-Plane, and it may be the Toliss or X-Plane, I'm not sure, that sometimes mean the DME doesn't show up. So that is unfortunately a possibility, but we would expect to have a DME on this approach. I'm also going to back that up with my progress page threshold as well. As you always would typically, it's just a good backup to have. The DMEs can fail, it depends. So Echo November Charlie November 03. Importantly for this approach, we have a slightly steeper approach, so we can see that here. ILS glide slope or localizer descent angle 3.4 degrees. So it's a 3.4 degree approach. So as we said earlier, because of that, I'm going to fly this approach fully stabilized. So it's a short runway. I've quite a light weight. We're down at 59 tons, medium auto brake. I'm going to use max reverse, but it also means I need to land flap full. So I'm going to land flap full, and I'm going to fly this approach fully stabilized. So in the hold at INRAT, well, actually, I'm going to fly from IPNUS to INRAT and then onto the ILS. So from INRAT, which is at 12.2 miles from the Charlie November, which is the ILS, I'm going to carry on at 3,000 feet, and at 8.2 miles, I'll begin my descent from 3,000 feet. Elevation of this airport is only 57 feet, so it's much nearer to sea level. So we're expecting the radio altimeter around about 2,500 feet, just like normal, slightly earlier perhaps. So as I said earlier, for this approach, we're going to configure fully before we start down. So how will we achieve that? Well, I know I'm going to descend at 8.2 miles from the Charlie November at 3,000 feet. So if I work backwards from there, that means at 9.2 miles, I want to be putting out flap full. And effectively, if you just put 5 miles before that, that's when you should start configuring, and then you configure something else at each point before that. So from 5 miles before, it's going to be 8.2 plus 5, so 13.2. We're going to put out flap 1 at 12.2, flap 2 at 11.2, gear down at 10.2, flap 3, and at 9.2, flap full. And then that should roughly lead us to descending with the glide slope like this. Now, that would only work if we could fly straight in, and sadly, we need to start configuring at 13.2, but as I can see, INRAT is at 12.2, so actually, a bit before INRAT, I need to start with flap 1. Another way is you could always put out flap 1 and flap 2 earlier, there's no reason, but I wouldn't fly for a long time, level flight, gear down, flap full. That's a lot of drag, and if you have an engine failure, the aeroplane won't be able to maintain altitude very easily, if at all. It may start descending. So you don't want to have flap full, gear down out whilst you're flying straight and level, so that's why we will do that about a mile before we descend from 3,000 feet. But that would be a stabilized approach. So we're being quite conservative here. We're giving ourselves the room because it's a slightly steeper approach. If we try to descend on this approach, as we did earlier, and configure somewhere about 2,500 feet, flap 2, gear down, what you'll find is the airplane will be accelerating because of the steeper descent angle. At this angle, the airplane needs a higher rate of descent to maintain the approach. As you can see, at 160 knots, to maintain 3.4 degrees, you need to be doing 963, so that's about 1,000 feet per minute. And if you haven't got enough drag out, the airplane will just accelerate and you'll make your life very difficult. So that's why we'll do a stabilized. Another reason might be a tailwind, because a tailwind is going to increase your ground speed. So if you're flying down a normal approach, but you're expecting to be flying at 140 knots, with a headwind, that's a ground speed maybe of 120 knots, but with a tailwind, it could be 160 knots ground speed. So tailwind steep approaches would be a classic reason to configure before you start down. You could just configure to any configuration you like. You could be flap 3 or flap 2, gear down, start down, and then put flap 3 and flap full. But today we'll just do fully stabilized. So let's have a look. I'll just finalize the setup here then. So we've got flap full. I need to put in the minima. Something that comes out of here that's quite interesting. ILS, missed approach climb gradient minimum 5%. So your airline will have a way to determine if you're going to make that today. Your performance manuals should tell you, so you know what weight. It could be that if you're really heavy and the air temperature is very hot, something like that, you may not make that, in which case you might have to use different minima thing or a different sort of approach. But here we go. We are a category C airliner in the 321 because of our approach speeds. So that's 279, as we said, that is the altitude, and the height in brackets is 238. So that's interesting. It shows us that this is not 200 feet above the runway, it's ever so slightly higher, 238 feet, and that's because of the steeper approach. So 279 is in there, and to go around altitude, if we have a look at the coding, 3,000 feet, so we'll just use 3,000 feet in the engine out acceleration. So now I can activate the approach phase, which is done, manage the speed, and as we said, a mile before INRAT, I need to put out flap 1, and then at INRAT flap 2, then gear down, flap 3, flap full, and we'll see how that works for us. So here we are now. almost at INRAT at 3,000 feet our platform altitude, and as we said, at a mile before INRAT we're going to start configuring. Passing INRAT, we'll put out flap 2. And that way we should be nicely ready for our approach. It's important that you are at your platform altitude if you're going to do a stabilized approach. Otherwise, you could configure earlier as you're descending as well. That would be another way to do it, but that's not really the intention of this one. This is the conservative way of doing it to make sure we're ready. So a mile to go. We'll put out flap 1, so it flaps to 1. Now, because we're in approach phase, the speed's reducing to S speed. Notice that the S speed is quite low compared to our previous flight because I've made us lighter now. At this weight, these speeds will be lower, so it's easy to configure. In a heavier aeroplane, you have to account for that, and you may need to configure earlier. It takes more time to slow down a heavier aeroplane because it has more momentum. And obviously, we'll be flying faster if you're using these speeds. Now we'll go to flap 2. We're 3 miles from our descent point, so that's going to be gear down. So gear down. Arm the approach and the other autopilot. There's a localizer. At 2 miles, we're going to flap 3. Two miles, flaps 3. And now we'll just wait. We can get the other bits done. Gear down flap 3 at a reasonable weight isn't too much of an issue. There's a lot of extra drag for flap full. As we pass 1 mile, I'm going to get ready and flaps go to full. A little bit late there, but that's no problem. As our speed is already back. If your speed is still reducing, you might do it at 1 mile. It's something to balance because, like I said, we don't want to spend too long sitting here. Gear down, flap full. And now reaching our descent point. Here's the glide slope. There's also nothing to stop you just sort of gear down flap 3, except intercepting the glide slope and then putting out flap full. It'll be a little bit more efficient. As long as the speed is back and you have drag out, you'll be fine for the approach. And there's glide slope start. Going altitude of 3,000 feet is in. Expecting our radio altimeter at 2,600 feet. Slightly early. So why might that be? Well, a good clue could be if there's terrain beneath you. That's something you'd have to account for. So as we can see, there are actually some hills beneath us, so that could set us off early. As you get to know airports, you'll start to work out where the hills are. The charts usually show them, but not always very accurately. As you can see here, there's no practical way of judging that one. Being visual does help. Quite spectacular scenery here in Norway. I recommend giving some of these flights a go on your home simulators yourselves, because I do like them. And this is just the default scenery. I'm sure there's better scenery out there. And now, some things that we need to consider for this ILS. This is a steeper ILS. So we are nicely fully configured. We're stabilized. We're at our V approach. It's going to be 132, but you'll notice the speed is higher. That's ground speed mini. I'll talk about that in another video another time. What we're going to do then is need to account for the fact that this is a steeper approach. So we've got a slightly higher rate of descent. It's probably needing to keep about 800 to 900 feet per minute to maintain this glide slope. In fact, you'll probably see it go to 900 soon. If it's doing this, then we're going to have to make sure we flare earlier. So instead of flaring by 30 feet, and by 30 feet I normally would say you need to do some sort of input before 30 feet. But today I'm going to make sure I've done that input at 50 feet. I think I'm going to start to at least do something, start putting on the side stick just to get that rate of descent under control, just to make sure we fit in. Just balancing that with floating along the runway. We've also got a bit of extra speed here because of that ground speed mini, so if that doesn't change, that could help us float. In which case, if we are going outside the touchdown zone, short runway like this, we'll just go around. Okay, here we are now, coming on to final approach. Time to disconnect the autopilot. Autopilot's off.
3.
And slightly different visual picture, slightly steeper. Nose is slightly lower as we try and maintain that. And now we can see that wind has changed, so it's swung around, which means that the ground speed mini is going to reduce back to more what we were expecting. Datum rate of descent that we're going to be watching for is probably about 800 feet per minute. So at 700 we know that's probably a little bit low. And just balancing the two. So slightly more flare needed, probably in this case. Looking out the window. starting the flare, idle thrust,
1,500 meters remaining,
and maximum reverse. Has reached 70 knots, idle reverse again. And now we'll need the engines to cool down for 3 minutes. And here we are. Bring it to a stop. Taxi speed, forward idle. That's it for today's video on ILSs. Hopefully we've seen a couple of things that are slightly different in ILSs, and also I'm hoping that if anyone doesn't know how to fly an ILS, they can use this video to get them through it in the Airbus. If you have any questions, as always, put them down in the comments, join our Discord, and you can put it in as a video request as well, and I'll try and get around to answering or making a video about it at some point in the near future. As ever, not for any real world use, just for us in Explain. Plenty more streams and tutorials and videos to come, so do please subscribe if you'd like to keep up to date with those. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video soon.